Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into something interesting.
Always ready. What are we looking at today?
Well, you guys sent in some excerpts from a 2024 International Finance discussion paper. It's all about corporate bonds during COVID.
Oh, that's going to be juicy. Everyone loves a good crisis deep dive.
Buckle up because we're talking a global roller coaster ride, Eurozone, emerging markets, the whole shebang. But first, let's set the scene. It's early 2020, the world is freaking out, markets are in a tailspin. What's the logical move for companies? Load up on more debt.
You would think that's a hard no,
Yeah.
right? I mean, look back at other crises like the global financial crisis. Companies hit the brakes on borrowing. Bond issuance basically fell off a cliff. But, and this is a big but, COVID was different.
This paper analyzed data from more than 60,000 companies across the globe, so they're looking at the big picture here.
Exactly. And get this. In the U.S., the odds of a company issuing a bond during those first few COVID months were 129% higher than normal.
Seriously.
Seriously. And in China, a 92% jump. It was like a global debt party, and everyone was invited.
Wild. Okay, so companies are scooping up debt left and right. But which bonds were the hottest commodity? I'm guessing everyone flocked to the perceived safety of U.S. dollar bonds.
That's the surprising part. It wasn't the U.S. dollar that stole the show. It was local currency bonds, especially in Europe and emerging markets.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it was a bit of a head-scratcher at first. The data clearly shows Asian emerging markets in particular were issuing local currency bonds like never before.
So I've got companies embracing debt during a crisis, and not just any debt, but local currency bonds, particularly in emerging markets. That's not what you'd typically expect.
Nope, not at all. It flies in the face of conventional wisdom. So the question is, what was driving this unexpected debt frenzy? And that's where things get really interesting.
So we're in this scenario where companies are piling on debt, local currency debt, in the middle of a global crisis. It's a bit like, everything's on fire, quick, get me a loan.
Yeah, it's a head-scratcher.
It
Right.
really is.
Yeah.
So who were these companies, these daredevils of debt? Did they know something we didn't?
Well, the paper dives into that, and it's actually pretty interesting. It seems like in advanced economies, like the U.S. and the Eurozone, it was mostly the bigger, more established companies doing the borrowing, the ones with those really solid financials.
Makes sense. If I were lending money during a pandemic, I'd probably stick with the companies that, have a good track record. But what about emerging markets? Those economies are generally considered riskier, right?
Absolutely. Emerging markets are a different beast altogether. Now, for companies in those markets that were borrowing in U.S. dollars, it was a similar story to the advanced economies. The safer firms were the ones usually issuing bonds.
Okay, so far so good.
But here's the kicker. The companies borrowing in local currency, well, they were a bit more, how do I put this delicately, a mixed bag. Not always the picture of stability you'd expect during a global crisis.
Really? So more risk-taking in emerging markets when it came to local currency bonds. That's fascinating. Why do you think that was the case?
It's a complex puzzle, but one piece might be the perceived safety net of borrowing in your own currency. If a company borrows in, say, Brazilian reals, and the real weakens, it doesn't necessarily affect their ability to repay those debts.
Right, because they're earning revenue in that same currency, so it's almost like a built-in hedge against currency fluctuations.
Exactly. Investors might have been more comfortable taking on a bit more risk, knowing those currency swings weren't as much of a concern.
Okay, that makes sense, but risk and reward often go hand in hand, don't they?
Always. Just
Yeah.
because those local currency bonds might have seemed less risky from a currency standpoint, there were still other factors to consider. The overall health of the local economy, for one,
Yeah.
and of course the company's own financial stability.
So many moving parts. It sounds like investors really had to weigh their options carefully. Speaking of factors at play, though, can we talk about the elephant in the room? Or maybe we should say the giant pile of cash on the table? Governments and central banks were making some unprecedented moves during the pandemic.
Yeah, it was a whole different world back then.
Definitely. So how do you think those global policy responses might have influenced this whole corporate bond situation? Those government and central bank responses were huge, weren't they? I mean, we're talking massive interventions, bond buying like crazy, interest rates practically at zero. It was intervention on a scale we'd never seen before.
Oh, absolutely. It was a whole different ball game back then. And you're right to hone in on that because it played a huge role in the corporate bond landscape. Think about those crazy low interest rates, right? It was basically like a giant neon sign flashing, borrow money now. It was incredibly cheap to take on debt.
So it was almost like central banks were trying to pump the brakes on borrowing costs to stop the entire global economy from just completely seizing up.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
And, in the short term, it seemed to work. These policies definitely injected some confidence back into the markets. Investors were more willing to open their wallets, and companies were more than happy to take advantage of that cheap money.
But it does feel a bit like a sugar rush, doesn't it? Like you get that temporary boost, but then what happens when the party's over and all that borrowed money comes due?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's actually something this paper hints at. They talk about the potential for a bit of a leverage hangover, especially in China, where we saw that massive borrowing surge. It basically means companies might be saddled with more debt than they can comfortably handle over the long term.
A ticking time bomb for the global economy. It's fascinating stuff. But how does this all translate for the average person who's just trying to, understand the world of finance and maybe even make some smart investment decisions? What should they be taking away from all this?
Well, that's why these deep dives are so important. Understanding these dynamics, even at a high level, can give you a real advantage. Knowledge is power, right? So keep an eye on corporate debt levels, especially in those areas where borrowing went through the roof during the pandemic. And think about the long-term impact of those super low interest rates. There's always a trade-off, and understanding those trade-offs is key.
It's definitely given us a lot to think about. A huge thank you to our expert for walking us through this complex world.
It was my pleasure. Always happy to dive into a good discussion.
And to all our listeners out there, remember, this is just the tip of the iceberg. What happened during those COVID years was unprecedented. It was a real game changer. The ripple effects are still being felt today, and understanding them is key to navigating the future of finance. So stay curious, keep asking questions, and as always, happy deep diving.